On August 18th, 1988, 21-year-old Chris Davis was hooked up to a polygraph machine, and he was asked, point blank, if he really was attacked by a giant lizard. The polygraph machine said that he was telling the truth when he answered that, yes, he was. For several months during the summer of 1988, the citizens of a small township in Lee County, South Carolina were terrified. Talk of a strange, aggressive lizard-like creature that walked upright and roamed the outskirts of Browntown ran rampant. People were being attacked by this 8-foot-tall bipedal lizard near or around an area called Scape Ore Swamp just outside of Browntown. No one was safe. Everyone was locking their doors at sundown, and they were staying inside until morning. Things got so bad that the local paper ran the story of the Lizardman, and then Emery Bedenbaugh broadcasted the news over his radio station, WAGS AM. After that, the South Carolina News Network picked up the story, and then the Associated Press. And for the first time ever, Browntown Road was plagued with traffic jams as people came from everywhere, all descending on Scape Ore Swamp, each one of them hoping that they would get a glimpse of the Lizardman. Onlookers were a mixed bunch of people. Some of them were believers, most of them were skeptical, but all of them were curious. And then WCOS-FM radio in Columbia, South Carolina, offered, get this, a $1 million reward to anyone who could bring in the, quote, lizard thing alive. This brought even more people to the area as droves of monster hunters now came into the town, hoping to make their mark and walk away with $1 million. Soon, the lizard phenomenon was out of control, and there were more people in Browntown than in Columbia. The Press-Courier ran a story on the Browntown situation, and the title read, "The Swamp Was Swamped." And things only got worse from there. On July 23rd, People magazine came to the area, and they ran a story on the creature. On July 25th, Dan Rather from CBS Evening News interviewed the town sheriff about the Lizardman. On July 29th, Good Morning America did a live broadcast from Browntown, also interviewing the sheriff. And the calls just continued to come in. NBC's Today Show called and talked to the sheriff. CNN called. Unsolved Mysteries called. And so many others. The sheriff said at one point they were receiving over 200 calls a day from people and news agencies all around the world who wanted information on this Lizardman. So, what exactly happened during the summer of 1988 in Browntown, South Carolina, that caused the Lizardman hysteria? Well, to answer that, we'll have to go back to a strange phone call that came into the sheriff's office just about 2 weeks earlier. Thursday morning, July 14th, 1988, was a hot, sticky, mundane morning, much like many other mornings in July in Lee County, South Carolina. The sheriff's office was just ramping up for the day, as deputies were coming in, grabbing cups of coffee and chit-chatting about their week, filling out reports and such. And then the phone rang. The person on the other end of the line called to report vandalism to his 1985 Ford LTD. The night before, someone had snuck up onto his property and mangled the car as it sat in its parking space next to the house. The information was written down and deputies were sent out to investigate. The call had come in from the Way family. The Way family lived in a small rural community known as Browntown. Browntown was located on the outskirts of Bishopville, and the house itself, well, it sat way out on the edge of a large swampy area called Scape Ore Swamp. When the deputies arrived, Tom and Mary Way and their daughter Shirley led them out to their mauled 1985 Ford LTD. Deputies were surprised to find that the chrome molding had been torn away from the fenders. The sidewalls were scratched and dented. The hood ornament was broken, and the antenna was bent. And get this, some parts of the vehicle's molding had actually been chewed by someone or something. As deputies looked over the vehicle, they saw clumps of reddish-colored hair and muddy little footprints all over the outside of the car. So their first thoughts were, well, an animal had attacked the car for some reason. But then they opened the hood, and check this out. Wires on the inside where the engine was had been torn and chewed. Well, this was confusing. Did an animal somehow open the hood, chew on some of the wires, and then close the hood as to maybe hide evidence before leaving? Perplexed, the deputies decided to call out the sheriff. Sheriff Liston Truesdale was in his office talking to a reporter named Jan Tutton when the call came in. Tutton, who wrote for a paper called The State, South Carolina's largest newspaper at the time, would occasionally drop by the sheriff's office looking for a story. She waited as the sheriff took the call. The sheriff was a hard-nosed, no-nonsense lawman with 32 years of experience under his belt. He had attended the Southern Police Institute at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. He had then continued his training at the University of Southern California. And then he studied with the FBI at their academy in Quantico, Virginia. He was no joke. He was educated and he was considered a crime scene investigation expert. The deputies respected Truesdale, and they knew that over the years he had seen just about everything. So they were hoping that maybe he could make some sense of things. Truesdale hung up the phone, grabbed his hat, and then asked Tutton if she'd like to tag along for the ride. The two walked out of the sheriff's office, got into the car, and then drove out to the Ways residence. When Truesdale got to the scene, he inspected the vehicle and he interviewed the family himself. He agreed that the evidence showed that it might have been an animal. However, because the hood had been opened and because of other peculiarities at the scene, he felt that it was highly unlikely. So he decided to call out a biologist from the South Carolina Wildlife Marine Resources Department. Looking at the hairs, the biologist thought that, well, maybe it might be a red fox. However, he didn't think that a red fox could have caused the type of damage that he saw on the Ways vehicle. Both Truesdale and the biologist took a very close look at those prints on and around the vehicle, and they thought, yeah, they most likely looked like they were probably fox tracks. But those tracks weren't the only set of tracks near the car. Just a little ways away and heading toward the swamp were larger, possibly bipedal tracks. And the very first thing that Truesdale thought was, well, maybe it was a bear. The investigation was puzzling, and because it was taking longer than the run-of-the-mill vandalism report, a crowd had started gathering just outside of the house. Some of the people there were neighbors. Some had heard the dispatch call come over their personal police scanners, and some were reporters. As Truesdale tried to disperse the crowd, he heard a couple of the people chattering, and then he heard others chattering about the same thing. And soon he realized that this just might be a little stranger than he had originally thought.
While we were there looking over this situation, we learned that the people of Browntown community had been seeing a strange creature, about 7 feet tall with red eyes. Some of them described it as green, but some of them as brown. They thought it might be responsible for what happened to the car. As we were leaving the house, I saw a guy that I knew by the name of JJ, and I said, "JJ, have you heard anything about a tall creature, possibly green with big red eyes?" He said, "What do you mean, that Lizardman?" And that's how we first heard of it.
Once Sheriff Truesdale heard the name Lizardman, he started asking around, and he found out that, to his surprise, quite a few people had had a run-in with this Lizardman, and many of the ones who hadn't, well, they knew someone who had. Most people described it as being 7 foot tall, aggressive, and incredibly fast. They said that it was powerful and either green or brown, with glowing red eyes and 3 fingers on each hand. It was known as the Monster of Bishopville, or the Lizardman of Scape Ore Swamp. Interestingly, the name Scape Ore Swamp has a somewhat colorful origin story. On land deeds over the years, Amy found that it has been written in several different ways. It's been written as Scape Ore Swamp, Scape Ore Swamp, and Scape Ore Swamp, and several other ways. Why was the word whore attached to the name, you might ask? Well, there have been many theories over the years, but the most popular one comes from historian Thomas Stubbs. A man named Frank McLeod, who was a local judicial court solicitor, told the historian that right around 1761, a woman of ill repute was causing a sort of ruckus in the St. Mark's Parish province of Craven County, South Carolina. The reputable folks in the area were not at all about to tolerate her frisky business ways, and they decided that they were going to run the whore out of town. Now, the woman barely escaped with her life, and she ran into the swamp, and she was never seen again. After that, the swamp became known as Escaped Ore Swamp. And over the years, of course, the name has softened down until it finally became the name Scape Ore Swamp that it is today. After the cat was out of the bag, so to speak, and people knew that Sheriff Truesdale was looking for any information on this Lizardman, several individuals came forward with their accounts, and although very interesting, many of them either just couldn't be verified or were too outlandish to add any real value to the investigation. But one account in particular stood out, not because it could be verified any better than any of the others, or because it wasn't outlandish. Oh, it most certainly was outlandish. No, the reason that it stood out was because the witness, Chris Davis, wasn't chomping at the bit, like almost everyone else in town, to tell his story. He wasn't seeking notoriety. He was rather reluctant to come forward. But on Saturday, July 16th, 1988, Thomas Davis marched his 17-year-old son, Chris Davis, into the sheriff's office. Mr. Davis had read an article about the damage that had been done to the Way's vehicle, and he thought that maybe the information that his son had might help that family. Truesdale was alone in his office and sitting at his desk when the two walked in. Chris sat down across from the sheriff and looked sheepishly at him, not really knowing what to say or where to start. Chris's father stood behind his son as Sheriff Truesdale just curiously waited. Then the sheriff put down his pen and interlaced his fingers and eyeballed Tommy with an expression of, "Okay, now what?" And whether or not Tommy gave his son an encouraging slap on the back of the head as if to say, "Come on now, speak," or if Chris just started talking, either way, the sheriff couldn't believe what he was hearing. 2 weeks earlier, and before the Way Families Ltd. Had been mauled, Chris had an encounter of his own. He had just finished working the night shift at McDonald's. He walked out of the door, got into his 1976 Celica, and tossed a bag of fish fillet sandwiches onto the passenger's seat. Then he cranked the engine and backed out of the stall. It was just a little past 2 a.m. when he pulled the car out onto the highway and headed home by way of Browntown Road. Browntown Road was a very dark road, but it was one that he had driven on many times and late at night. The road crossed Scape Ore Swamp in a very thickly wooded area, but from the inside of the car, it just looked like any other stretch of highway as he passed. About a mile after going over the bridge, however, he heard a loud pop, and then the car started to shimmy. After a moment, he realized that he had blown a tire, so he pulled the car over to the side of the road, got out, and looked at the damage. Chris did not have a flashlight, but the moon was out, and it provided just enough light for him to be able to tell that yes, indeed, one of his tires had went flat. Chris was exhausted, and he did not want to change this tire. He looked up into the direction of his house, and it was still several miles away, so walking was out of the question. He let out a sigh, and he looked around. It was quiet, and it was dark. He was surrounded by fields of very tall grass on both sides of the road. Although the moon was out, there really wasn't enough light for him to be able to see very far. He could tell that there was a tree line in the distance, which indicated the beginning of the swamp. He waved his hand in front of his face as a million gnats and other bugs surrounded his head. He walked to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and pulled out the jack and the spare. He jacked up the Celica, removed the flat, and replaced the new tire. As he was putting the flat and his tools back into the trunk, he saw a quickly moving shadow in the distance.
I had just put the tire in the trunk when I see this thing coming from the trees. It was large, human-like, with glowing red eyes. It was wet, green and about 7 feet tall. I ran to the driver's side and got in. When I was sitting in the car, I saw him from the neck down. He was outside the driver's side window. After about 2 yards, he jumped on the roof. I saw hands, rough-looking, black fingernailed hands, sticking down from the windshield.
Chris told the sheriff that the creature had 3 fingers on each hand and was making these deep grunting sounds as it was reaching past the window and trying to grab into the car. Chris said that he started up the Celica and he pushed the gas pedal all the way to the floor. The car shot forward and the creature was thrown off behind the car onto the road. Chris looked in his rearview mirror and watched as, get this, the creature leaped to its feet and then started running on 2 legs after the Celica. Chris wanted to, but he couldn't press the pedal down any further as it was already smashed up against the floor. And although the car was picking up speed, it was taking a second to do so. And check this out. As the car was going just about 30 or 35 miles per hour, the creature caught up to it and leaped back up onto the roof. At this point, Chris was freaking out, and he began turning the steering wheel, taking the car from one side of the road and then all the way back to the other, back and forth, trying to shake this beast off of the roof. And all the while, the creature was clawing into the window and banging on the rooftop. The Celica continued to pick up speed, and at some point, the creature must have fallen off because the clawing and the banging stopped. Chris was in full panic mode, and he was honking the horn as he turned off of the highway and into his drive.
Chris was so upset he left the car running. He was huffing and puffing. In a few minutes, he started crying. We asked him what had happened, and he said what he saw was 7 foot tall, had red eyes, and 3 fingers on each hand.
Terrified, Chris Davis ran into the house. Confused, Tommy Davis went out to take a look at the car. The driver's side mirror was bent, and there were scratches in the paint. Truesdale listened intently as Chris and his father told their story. Tommy Davis was well respected in the area, and Chris, well, he seemed completely genuine as he spoke. And as I said when I started this segment, this story was indeed outlandish. But as Chris retold it, It was obvious that what had happened had truly affected him. Truesdale's training and years of investigative work told him that Chris had indeed seen something that night. But what it was, Truesdale couldn't be sure. And Chris really wasn't sure either. As he sat there, he tried to rationalize it. And he thought, well, maybe it was a bear or something. But the more he spoke, the crazier it sounded. It was a bear with wet green mud all over it? No. One that ran 35 miles per hour on two legs? No. Whatever it was that night clearly could not have been a bear. All Chris knew was that this strange creature was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Truesdale pulled out a recorder and then had the boy retell the story. Then he asked them if they would be willing to take a lie detector test, and without hesitation, they both said absolutely. On August 18th, 1988, Chris Davis was given a polygraph test at the Sumter City County Law Enforcement Center. It was administered by Sumter Police Captain Earl Berry, and the results showed that Chris Davis was being truthful on all accounts. Interestingly, he never did say that he saw a Lizardman that night. The reported vandalism to the Waze car and Chris Davis's statement about being attacked by a giant lizard man, along with him passing that lie detector test, brought national news to Lee County, South Carolina. But after a bit, as they always do, the larger news companies went on to the next big story, and the hype eventually began to settle down. But the legend of the Lizardman was born, and it wouldn't die easily. Over the years, there have been numerous sightings of the Lizardman. Most notably, perhaps, came from a highly respected, high-ranking Army officer who chose to keep his name anonymous. For this video, we'll use the already reported name of Colonel Phillips, Colonel being his true rank. Colonel Phillips and his wife were driving home one evening after a wedding rehearsal. They were about 8 miles outside of Browntown when the colonel saw a tall, man-like creature emerge from the shadows. He said it ran across the road and disappeared into the brush on the other side. He said that whatever it was very fast. He reached over and he shook his wife, who had nodded off, and she woke up just in time to see the creature entering into a cluster of trees. The colonel slowed the car to get a better look, but he did not stop. It was dark, and the incident had shaken him and his wife up pretty good. But even though he didn't stop, he did go to the sheriff's office and make a report. Sheriff Truesdale found the colonel's story to be credible enough to dispatch a couple of deputies, and they went out to the area to search for signs of a large animal, tracks, broken branches, something. But perhaps because of the rain, they weren't able to find anything. Later, the colonel told the Lee County Observer that, quote, the creature was about 8 foot tall, with a tail that didn't quite reach the ground. In July of 1990, Bertha Blythers, a hardworking mother, took her 5 children, ranging from 4 to 18 years old, to dinner at a local restaurant in Bishopville. Just after 10 p.m., they all piled into the car and headed back home along the now famous Browntown Road. Tamisha, age 11, was sitting in the front passenger's seat. The other 4, Krista, the twins, and 18-year-old Johnny were all sitting in the back seat. The atmosphere in the car was jovial and upbeat. It wasn't every day that the children got to go out and have dinner, so they were all singing and munching on leftover French fries. Then, just as they were nearing Hickory Hill Road, Bertha slowed the car to go through the intersection. And when she did, Tamisha, who had her window rolled down, suddenly let out the most blood-curdling scream. And at that exact same moment, her mother saw it too. A large, dark figure appeared out of nowhere just up ahead on the right. And as they passed, this figure lunged forward and tried to get into Tamisha's open window. Bertha jerked the wheel hard to the left and pressed on the gas pedal. Tamisha started screaming uncontrollably as the car picked up speed and pulled away. Johnny, in the back seat, turned all the way around and he watched as the creature moved to the middle of the road, just stood there watching the car as it faded into the distance. And he shouted to his mother that it was still there, and maybe more curious than scared, he begged her to turn around so that they all could get a better look at whatever this thing was. But Bertha's only thought at that moment was to get her children to safety. She went to the sheriff's office the next day and she gave her statement. In part of that statement, she said this.
I was looking straight ahead, going about 25 miles an hour, and I saw this big brown thing. It jumped up at the window. I quickly sped up and went to the other side of the road to keep him from dragging my 11-year-old girl out the car. I only saw the creature from the waist up, but it was big. It had 2 arms like a human and was covered in brown hair. I'd never seen anything like it before. It wasn't a deer or a bear, and it definitely was not a person either.
There have been other sightings over the years. Most recently, in 2015, a woman named Sarah claimed that she saw the Lizardman. And check this out. She even snapped a photo of it with her mobile phone. She sent the photo in to local news and they ran a story on it. And the next day, believe it or not, a hunter called in and he said that he saw the very same thing that Sarah did, but he had been too afraid to come forward for fear of being ridiculed. But check this out. He said that he took a video of the creature, and since Sarah had sent in her footage, well, he sent in his as well. We'll provide a link to where you can find both the photo and the video in the description below. But if you think that the Lizardman is weird, wait until you hear about the Lizardman curse. Over the years, a lot of people have claimed to have seen the Lizardman or evidence of him. But those who are unlucky enough to have really got a good look at him mysteriously end up dying. These mysterious deaths usually happen about a decade or two after the person has seen the creature. Remember Chris Davis, the young man who saw the creature after changing his tire coming home from McDonald's? Well, just before midnight on June 17th, 2009, 2 men broke into his house and they avoided everyone else there. And they singled out Davis and they pumped a couple of shotgun shells into his torso, killing him instantly. And Johnny, Bertha Blythers' son, remember him? He got a really good look at the creature as the car was speeding away. And he wanted his mother to turn around and go back so everybody else could get a really good look at him as well. In June of 1990, he was killed in a horrific auto accident. And then there is Colonel Phillips. Well, his passing was maybe the strangest of all. He died suddenly and of mysterious causes. About these strange deaths, Sheriff Truesdale said this.
I've often wondered if there's something to it. It is unusual how some of the witnesses end up dying the way they did.
So, is there a 7-foot-tall, red-eyed, green or brown Lizardman dwelling deep within the murky waters of Scape Ore Swamp, somewhere near Browntown, South Carolina? Well, most people would say no. And it does sound rather fantastical, doesn't it? Believe it or not, Amy did find dozens of sworn statements from seemingly sane and sober individuals who have come forward over the years claiming that they most certainly have either seen it or evidence of it. But it is a fringe cryptid, even among cryptids. Even those who are brave enough to dive into the strange world of cryptozoology are skeptical of the giant lizardman who lives in the swamps of South Carolina. They point to the fact that there just aren't a lot of lizardmen popping up in swampy areas all around the globe. The lizardman is a rather isolated incident. But those who do believe in this type of thing, cryptids, point out the similarities that the lizardman has to the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch. They ask, could it have been a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch that was maybe mistaken for the lizardman? Each time that a witness saw it, it was dark and near a swamp. Could it have come out of the swampy water with its hair matted down, looking rather reptilian in the moonlight? And for that matter, could it have been just a normal animal, like a bear? What about Chris Davis, that polygraph test, and the Way family's torn up LTD? Well, even though Chris Davis did pass that polygraph test, I'm not so sure that we should take his statement as 100% truthful. Polygraph tests have been known to be wrong from time to time. That's why they're not admissible in court. And he didn't exactly give his statement away for free, believe it or not. After taking and passing that polygraph test, Chris Davis went on to become somewhat of a celebrity. Check this out. Charging people to make an appearance at social gatherings. Behold, the boy who saw the Lizardman. He even hired a manager. And the Ford LTD that started the whole thing? Well, experts have come forward stating that animals most certainly can and do create that exact same type of damage that was found on that car, especially when they're chasing prey. And if the animal were small enough, it wouldn't have to open the hood to tear up those wires. It would just crawl underneath it and up to where the wires were. So, where do we go from here? Well, perhaps we should look at the man who was the deepest into these investigations. Sheriff Truesdale, who was at the very heart of the Lizardman frenzy. And don't forget, he studied with the FBI, and he's considered a crime scene investigation expert. He made it his official statement that he, wait for it, does believe that these people saw something. But as to exactly what it was that they saw, well, he doesn't really want to speculate much further. An article in the Greenville News in 2015 quoted him as saying this.
I just don't know. I can't prove it was a Sasquatch, and I doggone can't prove it wasn't. There were some things that just can't be explained away. Too many people saw something. This stuff wasn't made up. It might have been a bear. I don't know.
So, what do you think? Were the people of Lee County, South Carolina, terrorized by a giant lizardman in the late 1980s? Or at least by something? Maybe a Bigfoot? Maybe a Sasquatch? Or maybe even a rogue bear? We would truly like to find your thoughts in the comment section below. And Amy and I would genuinely like to thank you for stopping by and checking out this video. We would love if you would stay with us on this journey as we share reports of paranormal events. Remember, we'll be back in just 2 weeks with another report. Until then, thank you again. And with that, well, I guess it ties it up for another report of the mysterious here at Rope. Thank you.